I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
Everyone is voting for Jack, 'cause he's got what all the rest lack. Everyone wants...
Everyone's talking about how young the candidates are, and it's true. A few months ago, Kennedy's mother said, you have a choice. Do you want to go to camp this year or run for president?
In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave or half free.
This is his introduction to the American people. Very few people knew who he was.
That's right.
And they dismissed him because he was a Catholic.
Yeah.
And they dismissed him because he was young.
Yeah, that's exactly.
He was in his 40s.
Yeah.
Here comes Nixon, poor man Nixon. We want Nixon to be our president.
And it was very hard for my father because there are so many what-ifs.
Roll along,
Those were giants in those days. 1960, a long time ago now.
If the present trend continues, if Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, will be the next president of the United States. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
It still works. It was just a wonderful campaign to cover. In all of my years of following American politics and covering campaigns, there has never been anything to equal 1960. Exciting every inch of the way, neck and neck all the way. And at the end, I think most of us still had no idea how it was going to come out.
You're traveling through another dimension.
Good.
Better, best. Super keen.
All right. Good evening. I'm Ed Murrow.
Creamy, convenient, fresh, natural, rich,
Hefty. American U-2 jet.
push button,
Plastics, automatic.
clean, classic.
No good.
To be a 12-year-old in the 60 campaign, it was a little bit of it was a scary world. It was, the Cold War was frightening because we had bomb drills. And Khrushchev was a pretty frightening figure. He was erratic and waving his fist, banging his shoe. You didn't know where he was coming from.
There was a great fear of communism, a great fear that the Russians were gaining on the United States. And the Russians, as a matter of fact, had fired off the Sputnik, the first space satellite.
Eisenhower brought the Republicans back after a long hiatus, but after 8 years, people kind of had it.
Well, listen, you're a young reporter. Ike was sick and old. He was up at Gettysburg. He was out on the putting green behind the White House.
Kennedy's record in the Senate includes a leading role on committees ranging from labor management relations to foreign affairs. He has been a moving force behind major legislation. His wife, Jackie, accompanied him while he voted in '58 when he was re-elected to the Senate. In '52, he first demonstrated his unusual vote-getting ability by winning in Massachusetts despite the national threat. At the U.S. Fair in Moscow, the Nixon-Khrushchev debate in a model American kitchen attracted headlines around the world. Nixon achieved the unprecedented opportunity of speaking directly to the Russian people. With leading cabinet members at home and as the president's representative abroad, he has helped formulate and carry out United States policy. In Poland, his popular reception demonstrated...
Basically, he thought he had the experience, and Kennedy did not have that experience. He thought he had a wider national reputation, and
He was confident, but at no time overconfident. I've never known Nixon to go into anything and be overconfident.
He was a patriot. He was a self-made man. And he thought he could do great things.
They were as unlike as black and white. They were just, Kennedy had a wonderful sense of humor, and Nixon had none.
All my friends said, don't go with Kennedy. He's a dilettante. He's not serious. He's too close to his right-wing father.
Well, my reaction to him when I met him in '46 was that he was a playboy.
Women fell in love with him, men fell in love with him, and Richard Nixon fell in love with him. This was the ease that Kennedy had, however he got it, was what Nixon most resented and what he most envied.
It never occurred to me that a young, relatively inexperienced senator like Jack Kennedy could get that nomination.
God, how young they look, huh, Bill?
Yeah.
And we were younger.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
God, jeez. Outrageous.
Mayflower Hotel, Washington, D.C. All of the major Protestant ministers, led by Norman Vincent Peale, were gathered in one of the Mayflower ballrooms. Totally secret. No press was allowed in. Nobody coming out was allowed to talk to the press at all. Well, I infiltrated myself into a sound booth where there I was in a sound booth with it all coming right to me, and I'm taking notes. Dick, what I heard was stunning. It was hate, and it was, brothers, we've had many differences before, but we are united in this year. We can't have a Catholic in the White House. And they were applauding it.
They were also the old farts.
As I was driving through Southern Illinois on Sunday morning, that is the Bible Belt in Southern Illinois, and I was flipping on the car radio from one station to another sermons. They were all spewing hatred against Kennedy as a Catholic. The Pope was going to be running the country. It was really intense.
It's hard to explain to people now how big the religious issue was in 1960. How people were suspicious of the Catholic Church, suspicious that the Pope would rule a Catholic president, suspicious that Kennedy would put his religious beliefs ahead of his public policy beliefs, suspicious that the Church was intent on telling both voters and office holders what they should do.
If you were re-elected president, you would be divided between two loyalties to your church and to your state if you were re-elected president.
The question is whether I think that if I were elected president, I would be divided between two loyalties, my church and my state. Let me just say that I would not. Now, you cannot tell me that the day I was born, it was said I could never run for president because I wouldn't meet my oath of office. I came to the state of West Virginia, which has fewer numbers of my co-religionists than any state in the Union. I would not have come here if I didn't feel that I was going to get complete opportunity to run for office as a fellow American in this state. I would not run for it if in any way I didn't feel that I could do the job. So I come here today saying that I think that this is an issue which ought to be solved.
When Kennedy started running, he realized the only way to gain his party's nomination was to defeat his major challenger, Senator Hubert Humphrey, in the primaries. And the primaries were becoming increasingly important. So the big test came in West Virginia, which was 95% Protestant.
So vote for Hubert Humphrey, the president for you and me.
For weeks, the attention of the nation has been focused on the voters of West Virginia and on the efforts of these two men to enlist their support in the presidential preference balloting next Tuesday.
put Humphrey in the White House and use our food for...
Now, the sound of this buzzer will indicate that your time is at an end.
Thank you, Mr. Ames and fellow Americans.
John Kennedy's religion was really still being used against him at that time. And Hubert Humphrey, who was a marvelous man, but in West Virginia, which was the make it or break it for his campaign, their campaign song was, "Give me that old-time religion." Now, that is really about as direct an anti-Catholic thing as you could do.
I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm gonna vote for
we'll do well.
Hubert Humphrey.
I think the Labor boys are with us.
He's the man for me. Yes, we need Humphrey in the White House. Humphrey.
Good afternoon, Mr. Thornton's office. Can I help you?
Kennedy just spent full time there. He practically moved to West Virginia. Practically ignored the rest of the country because he knew, at least in terms of his personal presence was concerned, because he knew if he lost in West Virginia, everybody would say, that's it, no Catholic can ever be elected president, forget him.
His dad told him to stay the hell out of there. They don't like Catholics down there, they'll chew you up.
They thought the Pope was building a tunnel, and seriously, the Pope was building a tunnel to the United States under the Atlantic Ocean. All kids would have to go to parochial schools. If Kennedy were elected, the Catholicism would become the official state religion. The Pope would regularly give orders to Kennedy. There'd be a Vatican representative in the White House. They really believe this, you know, it's unbelievable.
Almost all the reporters who went to West Virginia thought Kennedy was going to lose because of his religion. One day, I decided to go into the coal mining territory to talk to some miners who were coming off their daily shift. And one young guy just exploded with anti-Catholic fervor. Oh, we can't have the Pope in the White House. The Catholic Church will be running America. And when he'd finished, as I always did, I wanted to jot down his name on my little notepad. And he replied, Bias, Glenn Bias, B-I-A-S.
You mean fellows like you will vote against Kennedy because of his religion? Or will you?
I will, yeah.
You will?
I will.
Why?
I just think that I should vote for a Protestant.
Uh-huh.
You'd be amazed how many governors, state chairmen, local chairmen, who were Catholic, did not want Kennedy to run because they thought it would raise the religious issue. It would bring the ticket down to defeat, that he had no way of winning.
There were legends, and in fact, there were legends that, unlike most legends, are true, that Kennedy's father was in the state, not physically in the state, but sending money to the state and buying votes. And I know that to be true because I saw some of them. And the votes were bought very cheap. It was a poor state. He would buy a vote for half a pint of whiskey.
They waged the best campaign that money could buy, but Kennedy made a joke of it. In one of his speeches, he talked about getting a telegram from his dad, who had told him not to buy one vote more than was necessary, that he'd be damned if he'd pay for a landslide.
Man for me. Well, I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. Well, he's the man for me.
Well, I tell you, this is good fun.
Thank you, sir.
And politics ought to be fun.
Yes, sir.
And he said to me, he said, Lou, I just want to tell you, he said, if I had all the jack that Jack has, he said, I would have won this thing. He said,
they thought they might win.
Did they?
Oh, yeah. He thought. And I remember there was a moment saying, well, you know, these people are Protestants. They don't like Catholics. Somebody said that. Sure. And Hubert said, well, we don't want to win on that, but if we do, so be it. That's the way politics.
Kennedy won the primary because it came to seem that if you didn't vote for him, you were bigoted, you were anti-Catholic.
And he won by a landslide. But this didn't satisfy those old party bulls and party elders who still believed that Kennedy was just too young for the job.
Former President of the United States, the Honorable Harry S. Truman.
and I'm going to quote a statement that I'm making to Senator Kennedy. Senator, are you certain that you are quite ready for the country, or the country is ready for you, in the role of president in January 1961? May I urge you to be patient.
Presidential politicking reaches a crescendo at Los Angeles, where the convened Democrats wind up spirited skirmishing centered around party notable Senator Symington and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson.
Johnson invited Kennedy to come and address the Texas delegation.
As Lyndon knows, I never criticized. In fact, on every occasion, I said that I thought Senator Johnson should not enter the primary, that his proper responsibility was as majority leader, and that if he would...
Kennedy, with his good humor and good grace, blew Johnson away.
So I come to you today full of admiration for Senator Johnson, full of affection for him, strongly in support of him for majority leader, and I'm confident that in that position, we're all going to be able to work together. Thank you.
And they just erupted. I turned to somebody and I said, I think it's over with this convention.
What struck me when I arrived in Los Angeles was this big sentimental push to nominate Adlai Stevenson for a third time. But if the convention's heart was with Adlai, its head certainly was with John Kennedy.
The great senator from the state of Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. I submit to you, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois.
Well, I'm amazed. I'm not sure it's for me. Who else is here?
There were no delegates going this way. They were sitting on their hands. It was the gallery.
Mr. Chairman, Wyoming's vote will make a majority to Senator Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy knew that if it were left to the old pros who usually dominate a political convention in those days, that he would not be the candidate. As he said, if it ever went into a back room, my name would never emerge. That's why he had to win in the primaries.
In our devotion to this country, we wish to keep it strong, and we wish to keep it free. It requires, at this critical time, the best of all of us. And I can assure all of you here who have reposed this confidence in me that I will be worthy of your trust. We will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
The most electrifying moment at the convention was Kennedy's choice of LBJ to be his running mate. This shocked Kennedy's staff, including his brother Bobby. And I well remember that Northern liberals were just outraged that he had chosen a Southerner. And conservative Southerners were outraged Johnson accepted.
There was a very warm relationship between Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, but he had a conflict because he loved being majority leader with that power. I am certain that Jack Kennedy's father had been the one person who told him that no Catholic had ever been elected and that he had to carry Texas and some southern states, and Lyndon Johnson was a good man. And I think old man Joe Kennedy is due the credit for giving Jack the backbone, to offer it.
Bobby Kennedy was initially upset, and he had been talked to by representatives of labor with whom he was close after the labor rackets investigation, such as Walter Reuther, that Johnson was a mistake, that he was too conservative, that it would spoil the Kennedy image. And so Bobby began to talk to Jack about it and talk to Lyndon about dropping out. But, if truth be known, there was never a wonderful chemistry between Bobby and LBJ. They were just two different personalities.
Bobby came down to the Johnson suite and offered the chairmanship of the Democratic National Committee. He met with Speaker Rayburn and with John Connally, and when Bobby said he wanted Johnson to be chairman of the Democratic National Committee, it's a true story. Old man Rayburn said, "Chip, son," and kicked him out. And, you know, some of those real, what I call Southern Dixiecrats, they were furious. I mean, they kept coming in the suite and just saying, "You're a traitor."
I was on the floor of the convention, and Ed Jamison, remember him, the Dallas Times Herald? He was in tears. He was a newspaper man.
Treachery.
He was in tears that he'd been betrayed.
It was just what my father feared. He thought that was the hardest, that would have been the toughest ticket to beat, the Johnson-Kennedy ticket.
The vice president had clear sailing for the Republican nomination, but he kept looking over his shoulder, fearing a challenge from New York's liberal governor, Nelson Rockefeller, who finally stepped aside after Nixon agreed to a more moderate platform.
As the GOP convenes in Chicago, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York dominates the scene in the early hours, although declaredly not a candidate for either the presidential or vice presidential
I
nomination.
remember traveling with Rockefeller, and just as I was about to leave, Rockefeller announced he wasn't running, and the sigh of relief from the Nixon people was tremendous. Many years later, really, Rockefeller told me he thought that was the biggest mistake in his life, that he thought he could have beaten Nixon, and he was sure he could have beaten Kennedy.
His proposals for the Republican platform, agreed to by Vice President Nixon, touched off a storm of controversy.
And Nixon flew to New York to meet with Nelson Rockefeller, they called it the Fifth Avenue Summit, to try to bring Rockefeller aboard.
Or the Fifth Avenue Surrender.
Surrender.
As the convention got underway, there seemed no doubt that Richard Nixon would be the standard bearer of the grand old party.
Now, the curious thing was, Nixon was a fairly progressive Republican. However, the hard-line conservatives were willing to put up with progressivism, or even, to use the horrible word, you know, liberalism or moderatism in Nixon, because they thought of him as an anti-communist.
The big nominating conventions go into political history. First, the Democrats named the Kennedy-Johnson ticket. And now, in Chicago, the Republicans pin their 1960 hopes on Nixon and Lodge.
When politicians downgrade America's strength, they make a serious mistake because they invite communist aggression. Only strength and firmness can keep the peace.
Vote for Nixon and Lodge, November 8th. They understand what peace demands.
The presidential candidate of the GOP, Vice President Nixon, and his running mate, Ambassador Lodge, meet in the nation's capital. Rested up from an arduous week at the Republican convention, Mr. Nixon will shortly head for the far west and Hawaii on his first major campaign swing. Things are starting to pop as the candidates hit the presidential trail.
We left Chicago feeling we'd done what we wanted. We had some momentum. We'd had a good convention. We felt that it was time to get rolling, and if we're going to cover 50 states, we better do it quick and soon.
Times were good, and he was the right man. And who was this guy, Kennedy, anyway? You know, who ever heard of him? He was a little senator. So we were all measuring the drapes in the White House, figuring we'd get in there.
He was a very shy and, in a sense, an introverted person. He loved politics, he loved government, but if he could have done that without the campaigning, he would have been a lot happier, I think.
Why he ever got into politics still mystifies me. Here's a man who didn't like, basically, the kind of human contact that this world demanded, particularly in that time.
If you are happy now, what you're now doing
in the United States and in the world around us, Mr. Nixon's your man.
Missile gap became a key issue in the campaign, and I think that it was a false issue, as Kennedy found out when he became president.
If you share my view that it's time the United States started moving again, then I ask your help.
At some point in the campaign, the traveling press corps, which was a rough and tumble crowd like you and me, were joined by
More like me than you.
were joined by Doris Gleason, who was one of the most respected Washington columnists, a very senior columnist, and she was sort of trying to figure out for herself what the phenomenon of John Kennedy's, what that magic was. And she said, women all want to mother him. And I said, oh no, it's not mothering we are seeing. Not at all. John Kennedy's presence just released all inhibitions. But the thing that impressed me most of all, we call them the jumpers and the screamers. And if they had a baby in their arms, we'd call them double jumpers. And then, of course, there were the nuns who probably not jumped in many years.
He's on the street in Eau Claire, and he shakes hands with this elderly lady and says, "I'm Jack Kennedy, and I want your vote for president." And she shook her head, said, "Too soon, young man, too soon." And he said, "No, Granny, or whatever, now's the time."
Walking down Washington, shake hands with President Kennedy.
Kennedy said, if we could just lower the voting age to 9, I'll sweep.
Walking down Washington, shake hands with President Kennedy. Walking down Washington, like we
He'd come in from the crowd, and his right hand would just cut to pieces by rings and watches as he would put his hand into like a thrashing machine.
Yeah, that's right.
And he'd come in and he just said, how can he shake another hand with that mess?
Right.
He talked to me one time, we were on a Caroline. He said, how do you hold your hands when you're out campaigning?
Yeah.
He said, I'm not going to do the Nixon.
No.
I'm not Ike. I can't do that. And he said, this is the black... The Black Panthers or something like, or the steel work. The chop. He came out and he had a big discussion about how to do that little thing, and then the hair.
No, he got nervous about it. He said, "You think people think I'm cutting heads off?" I said, "No." I said, "Don't do it this way, that way," and he'd practice it, And
Well,
just right. So
were you ever there when he had a haircut?
Kennedy was not a great campaigner when the race began, but he got better and better. And it soon became apparent to me that his likability was a very important factor. He made brief speeches, he was witty, he had a great sense of humor.
I think that our chances... That never happens when the vice president came. I understand that everything's in perfect order all the time. They don't get the votes, but it's well organized.
Kennedy laughed. That was certainly a part of the reason for his victory, that he laughed.
I'm now going to have to give a new speech in a minute. You all know Pat Hillings, don't you?
The Democrats counted on LBJ to carry southern states. So at one point, they organized a whistle-stop train tour, what the reporters called the Corn Pone Special, with one memorable stop at Culpeper, Virginia.
Society, please call the reception desk.
Johnson just unable to do anything without some laugh along the way. And this famous train trip that went down through South Carolina, again shepherded by Bobby Baker. As they approached Culpeper, why Johnson was heard to say, put on the yellow rose, Bobby. And that was the loudspeaker, so that they had the yellow rose of Texas boom out over the countryside. Put on the yellow rose, Bobby. And he gets down and gives this famous speech of which that line shall live in immortality.
What has Dick Nixon ever done for Culpeper?
And not only that, what have the Republicans ever done for Culpeper?
And then another whispered, put on the yellow rose again, Bobby.
Our Florida guide I'd take a pistol and shoot myself if I ever heard the Yellow Rose of Texas again.
Here comes Nixon, our man Nixon. We want Nixon to be our president.
Merrily we roll along, roll along, roll along. Merrily we roll along, on the winning.
He has had experience, but on every occasion when the chips were down, if he had been president and made the decision, it would have been disastrous for the United States, and we can't take a chance now on that kind of inexperienced leadership. That's the issue of this campaign.
Every Republican politician wants you to believe that Richard Nixon is, quote, experienced. A reporter recently asked President Eisenhower this question about Mr. Nixon's experience.
I just wondered if you could give us an example of a major idea of his that you had adopted in that role as the decider and final.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
Can you imagine the President of the United States saying, I'll think of something that his Vice President did? Must have been a devastating blow. Think of the pillow talk that night at the Nixon house.
That gaffe by Eisenhower was kind of a dark omen for the Republicans of things to come. But the Democrats had their problems, too. The party was not that united, and there was still that one big concern.
From Houston's Rice Hotel, Senator John Kennedy is about to address a special meeting of the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, to which he has been invited.
The Protestant Ministerial Association of Houston, Texas, one of the hotbeds of the anti-Catholic feeling, invited Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kennedy to come and address them and debate the issue.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic.
Well, of course, Mr. Nixon said, no, I've been very careful not to raise the religious issue, so there's certainly no reason for me to come. And Kennedy, fed up, at wit's end on how to deal with this, said, all right, let's go.
I believe in a president whose views on religion are his own private affair.
When they talked to Johnson, he said, you don't need to protect him. He said, be sure to have the meanest-looking bunch of son of a bitches you got in that room on the front row, while that camera will shine on them, and then they shine on that handsome young man. And let America see the difference.
And this is the kind of America I fought for in the South Pacific, and the kind my brother died for in Europe. No one suggested, Dan, that we might have a divided loyalty.
They're kind of arrogant, ministers, men of God. I said, well, now, tell me, what do you think? Are you really opposed to a Catholic? Well, no, it depends on the Catholic and on that, but we're very concerned.
And when they fought at the shrine I visited today, the Alamo, for side by side with Bowie and Crockett, died Fuentes and McCafferty and Bailey and Bedillo and Carey, but no one knows whether they were Catholics or not, for there was no religious test there.
I could just feel it thawing. Not with all, because afterwards some of them said, he didn't impress me in that, but I think probably the majority of those ministers went out and said, we better be careful, better back off.
The whole strategy was to throw the Republicans on the defensive on the issue, and also to shame the public, which we did,
Nixon was very good about it. He said, I'm not going to raise the religious issue. And he said it repeatedly in every state, just to make sure that nobody thought about there being a religious issue.
Religion was a factor which was supposedly against Kennedy. It clearly turned out to be an issue which he used for himself.
But if this election is decided on the basis that 40 million Americans lost their chance of being president on the day they were baptized, then it is the whole nation that will be the loser in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics around the world, in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of our own people.
We ran this half hour that we made out of this whole thing.
Yeah.
We ran it in every television station in the United States at least twice.
Oh, my word.
There was more money spent on this show being exhibited locally.
Yeah.
Never went on the network.
Okay.
than any other piece of material, campaign material.
For heaven's sake.
Come on and click with stick, the one that none can lick. He's the man to lead.
Someone had done something, written a bad story, he would tell Herb Klein, I never want to see him again. Ever. Now, we knew what that meant. And that meant lay low for a while, but you know, then later on he would see him again, of course.
In Dick we have the one who truly gets things done.
He wasn't charming, and he felt that comparison with JFK, who was charming, hurt him.
Most of us were for Kennedy because we liked him, and we didn't like Nixon. He didn't allow us to like him. And so we felt we had a personal, at least emotional, stake in it. And we wanted Kennedy to win.
If there was a love affair between Kennedy and some reporters, their bosses were overwhelmingly for Nixon. 80% of the newspapers editorially endorsing the Republican ticket.
The nation's press urges Americans to recognize the great experience of Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge. On November 8th.
And I remember we were sitting around, a bunch of reporters traveling with Nixon, drinking one night. We used to drink in those days. And the correspondent for the New York Times, Bill Lawrence, W.H. Lawrence, wasn't it W.H. Lawrence?
W.H. Lawrence, William H. Lawrence.
Somebody said, Bill, don't you hate traveling with Nixon? I mean, he wasn't voting. It was just conversation. That wouldn't you rather be with Kennedy? And he said, oh, I guess so. He says, but I think I can do Jack more good being here. And I was just stunned as a somewhat idealistic 29-year-old reporter that...
That's a remarkable statement. I never heard that before.
I've never told it before.
No, I never heard that before.
I guess it's okay now.
You hear me now, speaking? Is that about the right tone of voice?
I think I better shave.
It was the first election, I think, where the major impact came from that little device.
Jack Kennedy was the champion of the boob tube.
Without television, he couldn't have won.
This is Warren's Mike. In 1956, I was on Adlai Stevenson's staff, and he called me up and he said, I'm having trouble with my television set. Do you think you could come up here and fix it?
Did he? You thought you were a television repairman.
You got to realize that these men did not know what a producer was, what television was made up of, what its complications were behind the camera.
Right.
All they knew was that they were suspicious of it.
The 1960 campaign brought into our politics something new that has been important that year and every year since, every campaign since, is the debate.
I went to see Kennedy, and I said, listen, this is something you've got to do. He is better known in the United States than you are. If you don't do these debates on television, you're not going to win the election.
Don't forget, that was the first presidential debate ever.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliates.
While Nixon was out campaigning during the day, Kennedy and I and one of our other staff people sat up on the roof of his hotel where he was getting a good suntan. And we had prepared, I don't know, 100 or more little index cards, issues and answers. And I went over to Nixon's hotel to pick him up. I saw the shirt on him. I just about died. I mean, he was so thin. I just couldn't believe it.
Vice President Nixon nurses an infected left knee in Washington's...
He was getting out of a car for a campaign appearance and really rammed his knee on the car door.
Presidential trail again.
He lost 10 pounds
didn't know he'd lost 10 pounds for that first debate, so he didn't look well.
Vice President Richard M. Nixon and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
The last thing Bob Kennedy said to his brother before we left the room was, kick him in the... I can't say it.
He called me up right from the studio, and he said, I know I can take him, I know I can take him, I know I can take him. He felt he had Nixon's number right there.
In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave or half free.
I said, Senator, all the votes are in that lens.
Yeah.
Look directly at that lens. You're talking to one person.
Exactly.
And look at those eyes.
Yeah.
It was right on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the United States fails, then the whole cause of freedom fails.
My grandmother immediately called Rosemary Woods and said, is Richard ill? Is something wrong? You know, she could tell her son didn't look right.
Within the administration, as a chairman of the presidency...
See a little drop of sweat coming out of his lower lip?
I have had the opportunity to make recommendations which have been adopted...
What happened was the perspiration on the upper lip.
Decision-making experience in your opponent.
He was sweating, and it was freezing cold. Freezing cold.
But he looks anxious.
Ed Murrow did an analysis of the slow motion, found Nixon's eyes were rolling, distraught man, and Kennedy was hardly flinching. And I think this difference in personality was more important, really, in the end than the issue differences that separated them.
Because we are in a deadly competition. A competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking.
If you watch television, Kennedy won. If you were listening to radio, Nixon won.
I think we disagree on the implication of his remarks tonight.
The first debate, supposedly, give or take, an audience of 70 million people, something like that, 70 or 80 million.
Had 90% of the television homes.
I've been asked by the candidate to thank the American networks and the affiliated stations for...
My father actually miscalculated because he thought more people would tune in for the last debate. But he was wrong. It was the first.
Good night from Chicago.
We've seen enough.
Enough already.
When it was all over, the reporters, we discussed among ourselves how we thought it had turned out, and most of us thought that it was a draw. And it was only the next day when we got out on the campaign trail that we realized that Kennedy had won and destroyed forever the notion that he was too young to be president.
Now you have to decide on November 8th, a week from Tuesday, the responsibility of Mr. Nixon and myself.
The Kennedy camp got a couple of breaks in the final days, one of their own making, the other totally unexpected. The first involved an uproar over the jailing of Martin Luther King after a civil rights sit-in in Atlanta.
If a particular law is not in line with the moral laws of the universe, then I think a righteous and just person has no alternative but to protest against that unjust law.
I remember that I knew about Mrs. Martin Luther King. Her husband was in jail down in Georgia. And I thought, well, if I could get Jack called down there, that would really be significant.
You know, nobody was getting in to see Nixon. But Jackie Robinson was a supporter, was a good Republican.
I said, hey, Jack, how about calling down there and talking to Mrs. Martin Luther King and saying something about how sorry you are that her husband is in jail down there?
So I went into Nixon's room there and said, you want to see Jackie Robinson? And he said, he'll want to talk about Martin Luther King. And I said, yeah, talk to him.
He said, that's a damn good idea, so how can we get her? I said, well, I got her telephone number here. I went to the phone in the hotel, got Mrs. King on the phone, and handed the phone to Jack. He got on the phone, started talking to her, and he's very good, you know?
About 20 minutes later, Robinson came out, tears in his eyes, and said, I'm never working for him again. And he walked on That moment was when Robinson tried to get him to pick up the phone. I think he had the phone number of the jail to call Martin Luther King. And Nixon felt that would be grandstanding.
Pierre said something like, well, do you know that 3 Southern governors have said that if we supported Castro, Khrushchev, or Martin Luther King, they'd throw their support to Nixon.
Kennedy asked me to come over to the Carlisle Hotel. See, we had to talk about something. I go to the Carlisle Hotel, and he's on to the governor, and he's telling him, now, you release Martin Luther King, because I tell you, Governor, you're a Democrat, I'm a governor. If I get in the White House, you know, release this guy. He said, George is going to really suffer.
I understand from very reliable sources that Senator Kennedy served as a great force in making the release possible.
Dr. King, have you heard anything from Vice President Nixon or any of his supporters?
No, I haven't. I've been...
It had an impact in an election that was that close. What if Nixon had picked up the phone? Maybe, 50,000 votes would have resulted. We did a lot of what-if-ing afterwards. But one of the things throughout the 60s was we recognized that was a mistake.
Just 4 days before the election, Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson were roughed up by demonstrators as they entered a hotel in Dallas.
We had a sort of a right-wing congressman from Dallas, Texas, named Bruce Alger. Bruce Alger had organized sort of a little social group of ladies to come out and protest Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. They jostled the Johnson just a little bit. And it was a sort of a madhouse for a minute. Johnson clearly said, and everybody in America heard him who was listening in, when the time comes that I can't walk my lady in Dallas, Texas, from the Baker Hotel to the Dallas Hotel, there's something wrong with our country.
These people were waving these signs and shouting and everything. Lyndon leaned over to Lady Bird and said, Bird, go as slow as you can. We want all this on tape. and they just instant way, and by then they were whacking them with the signs and all. It was just a Republican disaster.
By the time that story was played, everybody in Dallas and Houston was beginning to they were shamed, and they were beginning to take up for their fellow Texan, Lyndon Johnson. I think it switched the campaign.
Kennedy is showing, that's why Kennedy is going. All the way.
It was a crazy pace. I don't know how they all survived it. Do you?
He announced he would go to all 50 states, and he thought that would show vigor in the campaign, and it did that, but it also handicapped us and really concentrated on bigger states. So I think that probably was a mistake.
I think he should have taken greater advantage of Eisenhower's willingness to campaign toward the end of that campaign. It would have made the difference, because the difference was so small.
Mamie Eisenhower called my mother, and she said, don't tell Ike I called, but he can't do it. He's going to have a heart attack.
But the fact is, Eisenhower wanted to do it, and he didn't have to move very far. All he had to do was sit at a desk with a television on him and saying, it's my vice president, little Dickie Nixon, is the best thing this country has seen since me. And I think that would have won the election. But Nixon didn't want to win that way.
Eager crowds gathered outside the West End branch of the Boston Public Library.
as Senator Kennedy.
I remember we were talking on the phone, and he said, "Lou, I want this thing more than I want life," and he said it just that way.
Vice President Nixon and his wife, Pat, vote in the playroom of a...
When I look back on it, what's so interesting is that my parents did not prepare Tricia and me for defeat.
At his Hyannisport, Massachusetts residence, the Democratic candidate and...
He wrote this to me. If I lose, I will have no feeling that I could have done more. That is a nice way to end a campaign.
An early lead established by Kennedy dwindled as Western and rural reports came in.
They're still waiting for that one vote for Kennedy as 268 leads 269.
The election was so close.
Possibly the
On election night, you may recall, we couldn't call the winner until the following day.
On the television, the people and the experts were saying, well, Nixon's going to carry Illinois. I'll never forget hearing that and seeing it. I was devastated because that was the state for which I was responsible.
The big sweat out was Cook County. Could Mayor Daley deliver?
Kennedy received a call from Mayor Daley, who told him not to worry, and he used this phrase, with a little bit of luck and the help of a few close friends, we're going to win. You're going to win Illinois.
Illinois has turned around as going for Jack. He's going to win. He's going to win. He's going to win. I said, what the hell do you mean he's going to win? I was just there. I was watching. He was going to lose Illinois. But, it's been a big change. Suddenly a big change.
There was a lot of bitterness about Cook County in Illinois. We'd heard that that was stolen there.
Why didn't Nixon do anything about that? Well, as he presents it, because he's a patriot and he knew it would tear the country apart to question the election results. Well, that may have been part of it, but also part of it was that there were Republicans stealing votes in places, too, like southern Illinois. And most importantly, I think, Eisenhower told him he wouldn't back him.
If Kennedy had lost because of the loss of Illinois, boom, it would have been my fault. I can guarantee you that. It wouldn't have been the mayor's fault, nobody's fault. It would have been his, whatever I was. I was his cousin, but I was married to his sister. Boy, I would have been dead forever.
There was a terrific turnout, 63% of eligible voters, only 120,000 votes separating the two candidates. And despite popular belief, it was Michigan, not Illinois, that proved decisive.
That night, Mr. Nixon appeared at local GOP headquarters with his wife and cheers of campaign workers. At almost 4 a.m., he virtually acknowledged defeat.
I want Senator Kennedy to know, and I want all of you to know, that certainly if this trend does continue and he does become our next president, that he will have my wholehearted support and your support.
I don't know whether that was a concession or not. Do you, Dave? I suppose it was a concession, but I never heard one just like it before, what he said.
I asked Daddy how the election turned out, and he said, well, honey, I'm afraid we lost. And of course, Tricia and I said, well, I think there should be a recount. We weren't very helpful.
Vice President Nixon, Los Angeles, California. Your sincere good wishes are gratefully accepted. Sincerely, John Kennedy. The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s. I ask your help in this effort, and I can assure you that every degree of mind and spirit that I possess will be devoted to the long-range interests of the United States and to the cause of freedom around the world. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
And you think of this, that this unlikable person, not really charismatic, against this tremendously charismatic, dramatic, glamorous young man, we don't have anybody like that today, that they ran a dead heat.
It was a It was just a marvelous moment in American politics and a marvelous moment in my own career. I have to say, in all of my years of covering politics and political campaigns, nothing has ever equaled it.
After the election, they wanted Kennedy to come for lunch, Time Life Building. This was tradition. So we flew down from Hyannis, and they loaded me in with the president. Said, "Come on, Sidey, see, you may get a raise out of this or something." So we got in the limousine, and we were driving down Fifth Avenue, and we come in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Kennedy leans over, looks up, and says, "Thanks, boys."
Kennedy is going, yes sir, Kennedy is going.